Today, we're going to talk about dialogue. And I think this is a really important topic, especially right now, considering that we're all experiencing some challenging and complex times with COVID. And this is a time where we really need dialogue. We're also needing dialogue to handle big issues around racism in our country, as well as many, many other issues. And the truth is that I believe we really need dialogue to run our organizations well, even in the best of times. So that's why we're going to talk about dialogue today. And I'm going to attempt to switch back and forth between sharing my screen and not sharing my screen, which is new to me. So if I'm looking around, that's what I'm trying to figure out. So I have this quote to start with about dialogue. It's from William Isaacs, who is a specialty in this field. And he says, dialogue, the discipline of collective learning and inquiry, is a process for transforming the quality of conversation and the thinking that lies beneath it. And I want to talk a little bit more about why this is important. But before I do that, I want to just share a direction that I want to take everybody in today. You see, dialogue is something that's really worked on a lot in kind of the academic circles. And it really has lived in this workshop approach. These are your retreats. Has anybody give me a yes if you've done a retreat or an offsite or had some sort of outsider come in and lead a facilitated workshop to help you resolve an issue? Maybe there was conflict resolution involved. Yeah, I see some hand raising, some yeses. And my hope for you to leave this very short training today is to start taking a cultural approach. Now, for those of you who know me, I believe that if we want to change culture, we have to change our processes. And I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. And when we change our processes or our routines in our organizations, then we can really change the culture. But I feel so strongly that dialogue needs to be something that we do regularly with our teams in our organizations, and that it's something we can do on our own, that it's a tool we have, and we don't always need to wait for a facilitator or some sort of offsite in order to have meaningful dialogue in our organizations. So dialogue is really what we need whenever we have complex situations to navigate and things to solve. Now, one of the important things to realize about dialogue is we're not trying to reach a specific goal with dialogue. We're using it to unearth what's really going on, why so much turmoil is coming up, or sometimes we can dialogue to solve more simple issues, to understand what's really going on below that issue and generate a solution. This is a creative process, right? So we don't know what that solution is going to be necessarily going into the process. Now, you may have some ideas, but if you try to impose a solution and use dialogue to get to that solution, it's not going to work very well. Has anybody had the experience where dialogue or some sort of workshop process was used to get to a predetermined solution? Hopefully not, but if you've had that experience, let me know. Okay, I'm going to attempt to share my screen again. There we go. So we're thinking about doing this every day. And I've created this very simple ingredient list for you to use when thinking about how to have meaningful dialogue. And there are definitely many, many resources. If you go Googling dialogue, and facilitated dialogue, you'll find lots of resources. So hopefully this inspires you to do a little bit of reading. But even if you don't, there's some simple but powerful guidelines to follow to really achieve dialogue in your organization. So first is time. You have to make time for dialogue. It's not a fast process. You have to give it time to develop. But what I can tell you from my experience, because I teach everybody who does the impact method learns how to do dialogue on a weekly basis, sometimes more frequently. And what happens is when we address our issues in this way regularly, the time we spend in dialogue pays dividends in the future, right? Because it's like we're getting at the heart, the root cause of the problem. And so when we do that, all of the symptoms that keep springing up and getting in our way, they are kind of poof, they're kind of resolved. So even though it might feel like when you're in a crisis or a really complex moment that you don't have the time, taking the time for dialogue will save you time on the other side many times over. The next thing that you need for dialogue is presence, right? I think too often people are entering meetings these days that aren't that meaningful, and they're on their phones, right? They're checking away, they're multitasking, and that's not really going to make dialogue work. You have to train people to get used to saying, we're going to spend this time and we're all going to be present. And the more present we are, the less time it may take. And if we aren't present, we won't get to a meaningful common ground and meaningful solution, and it's not going to work. And I think this is, it's the nice thing about a facilitated offsite workshop is it's a lot easier to get people to be present for 1 or 2 days when you really change their setting. And that's one of the tools. If you research dialogue, you can definitely control the environment to help people be present, whether you're sitting in a circle or it's a relaxed environment. But one of the things I've learned about presence is you can also just, people are capable of being present, and you can create a culture and an expectation that when you're having a dialogue, that everybody will be present. So it's something that can be developed in a relatively short amount of time on a regular basis in your organization. The third ingredient here is suspension of judgment. And this is probably the hardest thing in dialogue, and the thing that probably takes the most time to develop with your team. It's also an area where a facilitator can play an important role. So if tensions are really high and your team has divided themselves on 2 sides of a situation, 2 opposing sides, that might be time to call in a neutral third party who can help facilitate. But what is that facilitation process really? It is a process of helping people temporarily suspend their judgments so that they can fully see the situation from all sides and all perspectives. And there are several stages in a dialogue where people might tend to bring their judgments. And often, as you go deeper and deeper into the issue, judgments, really deep-seated judgments and beliefs can flare up. But learning to suspend these judgments is a really supportive and helpful thing to do for your entire organization and your team. Now, again, if their tensions are really high, I recommend a facilitator. But otherwise, I want you to know that you don't have to have a facilitator, especially as your team gets used to having dialogue. They learn over time that this is a safe space and that it's okay to suspend their judgments. And they're not going to, oftentimes our judgments are like a protective shield that we wear. And so we get used to being more vulnerable. Something Brené Brown talks about a lot. And when I talk about suspension of judgment, this is very closely linked to vulnerability. In fact, I'm going to share one of Brené Brown's resources with you that I think basically shares this list, but from a different perspective. And then the last tool you really need for dialogue is deep questioning, or the last ingredient in my ingredient list, deep questioning. There's a practice, I don't remember who developed it, called the 5 whys. And it's a very simple exercise. You just ask why something's happening, and then whatever answer you get, you ask, well, why is that happening? And whatever answer you get, you ask again, why is that happening? And you ask why as many times as you need. But typically by the time you've gone 5 levels deep on why, you've gotten something really meaningful. And when I use that deep questioning method of asking, well, why is that happening? Or why do I believe that? When we go really deep, we go to the point that it's so basic that it doesn't help us. And then we go one level up in our whys. So deep questioning is a tool that everybody benefits from developing, not just in dialogue, but in their daily work. And when we think about how important it is that all of our team, all of our constituents stay accountable for things, having a practice of deep questioning helps people hold themselves accountable and make the right choices for your organization. So deep questioning might look like, well, why is this happening? Why am I having this reaction? So what do we do with this information? Or now what do we do, given that that was then and this is now? What is our context now? Those are the kinds of questions that surround deep questioning. You can Google this. This is a checklist from Brené Brown. It's called her Daring Feedback. It's Daring Feedback, the Engaged Feedback Checklist. I'm not going to read it to you, but I just want you to know that this is a resource that's out there. And if you look at this checklist, you'll see it very much has to do with the ingredients of dialogue that I just shared with you. And if you want to start working with your team and getting them used to showing up for a dialogue in a new way, I highly recommend you use this tool and share it with everybody before your dialogue meeting. And just ask them to think through it and agree to it and check off each thing as they come into the meeting. Sometimes it's helpful to hold a little safe space and answer any concerns before you actually start so that everybody feels comfortable checking off all the items on this list. As always, you can apply for a free consultation call with me if you'd like to discuss this one-on-one. And now I'm going to answer questions off the recording. So give me a moment to stop the recording and I will answer questions.